The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on responsible data stewardship. What is data stewardship and why does it matter? Today's webinar is brought to you by the Emery Group and RockITek. My name is Mark Emery, Managing Partner of the Emery Group, and I'm pleased to moderate today's webinar as the broad topic of data stewardship has been a passion of mine since I was the Deputy CIO at the Department of Homeland Security. One of my most proud accomplishments at the department was the creation of a data stewardship program inside the Office of the CIO. We knew back in 2005 that managing our data assets and being able to share it would provide us with competitive advantage in protecting the homeland. However, we wanted to use that data securely, but the only tools that we had at the time were firewalls, passwords, and the beginning of security monitoring. Our holy grail was to be able to have the data protect itself and have knowledge of who, what, when, and where it could safely be used. Network security and identity management have come a long way, but that holy grail of data protection is only now. Well, I'll let my presenters today and over the next several weeks talk about the new data stewardship and a number of current and relevant topics, from how data can be protected in order to do business with the Department of Defense to keeping your company's name off the front pages of the newspaper. As we go through the webinar, if you have questions for our presenters, please post them under the question tab on your GoToMeeting control frame. Our presenters today are two luminaries in the charge for data stewardship. First, Brigadier General Gary Conner, United States Air Force, retired, has spent the last several years helping companies approach some of the government's biggest problems with a systems thinking strategy for solving complex problems. This is a specialty that General Conner honed during his 32 years in the Air Force. Gary is joined by Joe Sturonas, Chief Technology Officer for PKWARE. Joe has been advising major corporations and software development firms on security issues and protecting data by encryption and other means for many years. Gary, our topic today is data stewardship, the challenges that need to be addressed, how organizations can rapidly advance their data stewardship. First of all, Gary, can you tell me, what is data stewardship?
Mark, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to participate in this forum. I think the topic of protecting our data is an issue that has touched each and every one of us, both personally and professionally. From my perspective, data stewardship should be a purposeful strategy for protecting an organization's data. It should be grounded in the fact that data is a strategic asset. Everyone talks about data as the new oil, but it's really a reflection of the organization's investment in their capabilities and in often cases their differentiators. Data is at the very heart of the organization's mission, business outcomes, and customer experiences. And finally, I think it needs to be a strategy that is adopted by and understood by the organization's senior leadership. They've got to own this strategy and drive its implementation and drive its outcomes, because data is at the core of their business and their mission.
But Gary, what are the consequences of organizations losing control of their data?
Now, let me talk about that from a couple different perspectives, from both the commercial and the federal and the defense sector. On the commercial side, companies lose customer and supplier confidence when the data goes out the door. They suffer remediation costs, and they suffer going forward liability costs. Think insurance to prevent against a similar occurrence. On the federal and defense side, it's a similar loss of confidence, but now it's a loss of confidence for the citizenry. It's a loss and a squandering of the taxpayer investment. It gives our enemies a distinct advantage, because now they reap the benefits of our investment without having to make a similar investment on their part.
So who's responsible or accountable for data stewardship?
Great question, Mark, and one that I think is important to resolve within the community, because the folks who own it are the ones who actually end up driving it. A lot of times you'll hear about the Chief Information Security Officer, the CIO, maybe even the Chief Management Officer or the Chief Data Officer owning this type of strategy. I would contend that it has to be at the executive leadership level. I would argue the CEO truly needs to own this. Now, who executes it from a CMO or a CDO perspective or a CIO perspective, that's fine. But executive leadership needs to own it because, again, it's a recognition of the fact that data is at the heart of their business and their mission.
And from your perspective, what are the principal elements of a data stewardship strategy?
Well, there are two dimensions to this, Mark. The first is obviously the data and thinking about what types of data you want to protect, when do you want to protect it, and where that protection should take place. The second is who are the users or the consumers of that data? What data do they need access to? And similarly, what data do they not need or should be prohibited from having access to? What I call the friends and family network. So those are the two principal elements in my perspective.
And so from a strategic thinking point of view, what's needed now to protect the data if it's not the typical hardware network protections that most people talk about?
Well, if it truly is all about the data, then I would challenge the community to think about what is their typical approach to protecting their data. I would argue it is still hardware-based and infrastructure and architecture-based. I think a true data stewardship strategy focused on protecting the data, because it is all about the data, is what we should be leaning towards.
Well, thanks, Gary. Joe, you've been advising the world's largest financial institutions. How do you recommend organizations get started on their data stewardship journey while protecting their most critical assets?
Thanks, Mark. I would look at this more in just to kind of key off of what Gary had just said around a data-centric approach. I think we need to look at this in a framework, and I'll just choose the NIST cybersecurity framework as the framework to think about. The NIST cybersecurity framework, just as a level set, includes identify, where you're actually looking for sensitive data, trying to classify. So discovery and classification kind of fall into that realm. And then also protect. This is where data protection, reporting, DLP, rights management might come into play. We're actually looking to be able to protect that information, as well as then, of course, detect. Once a breach has happened, you want to be able to detect that breach. Once you've detected a breach, you have to respond to that breach. You need to be able to assess the damage. You need to be able to do the forensics. And then, of course, there's the recover, where you want to be able to get back to normal operations, restore services, and then also try to understand what it is you can do to prevent that. I think it's interesting about this is that there's really two sides to this framework. There's the proactive side, which is the identify, protect. And then there's the reactive side, which is the detect, respond, recover. I think what we want to be able to do is look at this from a different perspective. This chart was actually created by Sunil Yu, who's a former CISO for a global bank. This was done at the RSA conference in 2016. What he was trying to depict in this chart is taking the NIST cybersecurity framework of identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, and look at this from a pre-event and a post-event perspective, looking at the technology and the people and the process that are involved in each of these. And as you can see on the identify, protect, the technology is more of a focus, whereas in detect, respond, recover, it's more of a people process. I think what he was trying to understand is that where are people spending most of their spend in terms of their cybersecurity budget? And what he found is that most people are spending more money, more time and resources and detect, respond, recover. And until you actually start focusing more on the pre-event, the identify, protect, you're going to spend a lot more time on detect, respond, recover.
And Joe, what I like about this chart is by focusing on the data and the users up front as a part of your data stewardship strategy, you end up with an implementation that transcends where the data is at, and it also transcends what your architecture, your network, or your devices are, because you really don't care. You're focused on protecting the data.
Yeah. So Joe, how do companies that you advise proactively approach this data stewardship?
Well, I think of really 4 steps. If you look at this from a persistent data protection perspective, this is different from the sort of device and network-based approach. This is being able to protect data at its inception, more of a cradle to grave, so that it's protected at rest, in transit, and wherever it goes. And if it is actually exfiltrated, it's ciphertext. It's useless to anyone who doesn't have the keys to be able to decrypt that. I think there's an architecture independence that has to come into play. I think that's even more true today as we have more people working from home, and now this data is going on many different devices. We talk about being on-prem or in the cloud. Now all this data is now being distributed to a lot of different home networks, where we really have to think about protecting the data itself, because it's just impossible to be able to protect each individual device that this data is transferring to. It has to be transparent to users and mission operations, because if people aren't, if it becomes an impediment to business or mission, they're not going to use it. So we want to be able to do this in a way that is transparent to the way that they are actually using and moving and transferring data. And at the end of this, it's really about automating these security policies so that we're protecting this data at its inception, where it's actually being created, and it remains persistently protected as it goes through on-prem, cloud, and on mobile devices. So where to start? I think there's a baseline that we have to think about. I think you really have to think about what within your organization you care about. Is it you care about compliance? Are you trying to satisfy an audit? Is it intellectual property? Is it the information that you're trying to protect, you don't want to get in the hands of your competitors or a nation state? Or is it reputational risk that you're trying to avoid, making sure that PII isn't leaked out and then looking bad on your organization? At the end of the day, this is really about protecting the data. It's not really about protecting devices or networks or things like that. That's all part of it, but ultimately we're trying to protect the data. So we have a foundation for data stewardship, and this really focuses on a data security workflow that involves discover, trying to understand where all that sensitive data is at. Once we've discovered that sensitive data, then we can classify it or tag it so that we know what's sensitive or not. Protecting the data. That certainly could include encryption, but it can include quarantining, deleting, redacting. There's a number of different ways that we can protect that data. And then reporting on that data. Who has that data, and what's being done with that data, and where is that data being acted on? So discovery is really the first step. We want to be able to understand where that data exists. And discovery, in a lot of cases, especially in the environment that we're in today, it's really about the endpoints. Where on the endpoints does this sensitive data live? We think about DLP, and in DLP you could think about in 2 different ways. There's perimeter-based DLP, where it's trying to prevent data that might be egressing the organization, as well as endpoint DLP, which is focused typically around file shares and things like that. I think discovery is really about not just only the endpoints, the desktops, laptops, things like that, but also the file shares as well. And discovery can then remediate, and they can actually act on that data once it's been triggered. Classification is one. It's interesting because it's really it's being able to classify your data using your organizational rules. I think a lot of times when people think about classification, they think about it being a manual process where maybe you're in Word and you have the opportunity to be able to classify the data that you might be working on. Maybe the data is confidential, highly confidential. Maybe it's internal, or if it's public and it can go anywhere. There's also the ability through discovery to then also make that more of an automated process. And so you can actually, based on the content of that data, or maybe even the metadata, you can actually then classify that data in a way that it's germane to the organizational rules. I think successful classification is really probably a blend of both manual and automated. You want to be able to have the users be able to manually classify some of this data, but you also want to be able to get after all the legacy data that you have and be able to do that in an automated process. And then on to protection. It's really, this is, I think probably most commonly we think of encryption as being that data protection element, and certainly that's one of the aspects of protection that's important. There's also moving that data into other areas, getting it into certain ecosystems. There's quarantining, there's masking or redacting, where you can actually redact the sensitive information within a document. Deletion, being able to focus on data retention policies. I think data that's left around that is never actually acted on with a data retention policy sometimes can actually be a threat actor. Some data that's not important to you or your organization might be very valuable to a threat actor. And then, of course, the reporting and auditing for a chain of custody that goes along with this as well. It's really about protecting the data that you care about. Persistent data protection is a concept where, instead of thinking about being able to protect data on specific devices, storage devices, networks that might be transmitting across with SSL and TLS, this is about protecting the data itself. So it's independent of that, because data really lives in many different places. It can be, like I said before, it could be on-prem, it could be in the cloud, and then all the different endpoints where this data exists. If we don't have a strategy, a data stewardship strategy that protects that data itself, it's just impossible these days to be able to protect all the individual devices where that data might go. Think of it this way: if you had two people that were collaborating on a spreadsheet, let's say in a file location, they each have the ability to be able to access that data. Let's say maybe it's for some M&A activity, and they can act on that. They also want an administrator to be able to back that data up. They're able to decrypt that data and act on it and collaborate on it. The backup administrator can back that up, but because the backup administrator doesn't have the key to decrypt, all the backup administrator can do is back up that file, and all he sees is ciphertext. That's really the essence of data-centric protection. And then there's reporting. Reporting is really where the data stewardship policies become visualized. We're able to report on any of the events that occur: encryption, decryption. Where was that encrypted? Where was it? How was it encrypted? With what policy, what keys, and so on. This really gets to a support of chain of custody. We're able to then send these data security events to a SIM, security incident and event management, as well as entity and user behavior analytics. So if through those analytics you detect that a user is acting in some sort of a rogue behavior, you then have the ability to automatically revoke the keys of that user, so they are no longer able to then decrypt any of the information that they have access to. I'd like to present a demo now that actually shows this in action.
Hi, this brief demonstration will focus on data protection as it applies to data stewardship. I'm going to show how a policy that has been defined can automatically discover, classify, and protect data stored in a file folder on a file share. The policy has been set up to encrypt all files after they have been classified, so only authorized users will be able to access and view the contents. Then at the end, I'll show the visibility an organization should have so they understand where sensitive data is stored, how it's being protected, and who is accessing the data. I've logged into our demonstration environment in AWS, and I'm running Windows 10 on my desktop. In the scenario I'm going to take you through, I've created a file folder on a shared drive called Team Apples, and this allows myself and my workmates to share documents amongst us. What I've also done though is I've created a policy to monitor this file folder, so any document placed in this folder will inspect it, will classify it appropriately, and will encrypt it using a shared key between myself and my workmates. Here you see this document's been labeled confidential and it's been protected. The document to the left did not contain PII or sensitive data, so it's been labeled unclassified but still protected. And the protection then allows me to practice good data stewardship and only allow the people with the need to know to be able to access this data and view it. By the way, the policy I've set up to monitor this folder could be applied to email. It could also be applied to a file and sync application like Box or Dropbox to be able to protect data in a file folder. Especially would be valuable if you're passing information to a user outside of the network or a partner where you want to keep that information protected for only those with the need to know. Now, just to show how this policy behaves without any user interventions, because it's automatic and always monitoring that folder, let's drop in a few documents. These are one I need to share with my team members. So you see those were in search, appropriately classified, and protected. If I want to access data in these, I simply one click, open it up, and that opens in the appropriate application. When I'm done, I can save it. So the workflow is minimal on any changes made. The policy automatically inspects and protects the data, and if I need to access the data, I simply click on the file to open it up. Now, in this use case, David West is currently a member of the team, and David has access to this data. As a matter of fact, let's say David drags a file out of the folder. That's still persistently and protected with that shareable key. David can open it, David can access it. When he's done, he can save it, but that is protected outside, still on his desktop, even though it's outside the folder. But in this scenario, David's leaving the team and James Stewart is joining the team. So what I need to do is simply go in and modify the key and change access. I'm going to open up the administration console. And I'm going to go into a tab that allows me to manage keys. Now this is a process typically the security administrator in the organization would be doing. But here I'll go in. I'm going to add James Stewart. Now this integrates with Active Directory, so you'll see I just put in part of his name. Active Directory was searched and his name was presented, or a list of names that start with James were presented. I selected the correct one, and I'll remove David West. So I've listed all three users that have access to that document or to the key to decrypt the document. I could have also used a security group and had the Active Directory administrator create a security group that I would have listed here in this community. But just to save time, I chose to list each user separately. Let's go ahead and save this. Let's jump back now and test and see if these changes have applied. So I'm going to go to David West's desktop. Let's see if he can still access the file he moved to his desktop, and he can't. He's being prompted for a passphrase, which means that he no longer has access to that shareable key. Let's go test James Stewart's desktop just to make sure that change took place and see if he can access a document. And he can. So he's the new member of the Apples team and he can access the documents now in that file folder. Now the last thing I want to show you before I wrap up is I want to go back to my desktop and I want to go over to the reporting tab in that console. The reporting tab lists each event that occurred in the processes I just went through. You see down below, I did discovery events, I did an encryption event after the discovery event, then I did some decryptions to show you the contents of the documents. I came back and I updated the security key that's being used to encrypt the documents. And you see down below, it shows that I added James Stewart, I deleted David West, and then I did testing to make sure that David no longer had access, and you see here that he had to abort the operation if you look at the status, so he no longer had access. And finally, I'll click on this top item to show all the attributes for that decryption event. At the bottom, the user that was accessing it, James Stewart, the strength of the crypto algorithm used for that file, and the actual archive name itself. As a matter of fact, if I want to see chain of custody or who's accessing this data, it's easy to do a match on that particular attribute, and I'll see only the events associated with the access to that document. This information can be exported to a syslog or a SIM tool for dashboarding, event reporting, or even alerts. And that concludes my demonstration. I hope you find this to be of value. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Jim. I think what that demo that Jim showed was actually a combination of things that we've talked about from a data stewardship perspective: discovery, classification, data protection, as well as reporting. He was able to show what it looked like when authorized users are accessing this, as well as when unauthorized users are accessing this. It provides the ability to have the re-encryption of that data wherever it is automatically. So with that, I will turn it back over to Gary.
Joe, thanks. Jim, thanks. I think the demo and this discussion has really helped me, and I hope helped the audience understand what a full lifecycle dynamic persistent data protection approach could be based on their data stewardship model. If you think about the dynamics of the data in your organization, the dynamics of the folks who use that data, whether it be an industrial base or a collection of users in an air operations center or anywhere in between, by creating that visibility, giving the owners the responsibility for controlling their data, making it transparent and almost less impactful or non-impactful to their mission operations, is, in my view, the way to go for a persistent data protection strategy that is implemented under a data stewardship framework.
So Gary and Joe, thank you very much for your presentations. We have a couple questions here from the audience that I'd like to get you in the few minutes we have left. Joe or Gary, can you provide an example of a company or agencies that are getting this data stewardship right?
Yeah, Gary, do you wanna start? I can follow.
Sure. We have a couple of current examples. There's a defense agency in particular that is taking a look at implementing a data stewardship strategy for both internal agency operations as well as securing the data up and down their supply chain.
And I was going to mention there's some global banks that are actually doing, and financial institutions that are actually taking an approach of discovery classification and data protection from a data-centric approach that's actually helped them to be able to protect both data from on-prem as well as when this data is actually going into other areas such as cloud and actually leaving the organization.
And I wish that OPM had this capability a decade or so ago, and because that way the Chinese wouldn't have my security file.
Okay, great, gentlemen. We've reached the end of our time frame. I want to thank again Brigadier General Gary Connor and Joe Sturonas for presenting today. Some of the questions we didn't have time to answer, those will be posted with some answers up on the RockITek website, along with a streaming version of the webinar, which has been archived. I'd like to ask everyone to please join us next Thursday, where our guest presenter will be Captain Glenn Hernandez, U.S. Coast Guard retired and former CISO of the United States Coast Guard. Our topic will be the capability maturity model for cyber and how data stewardship can help companies comply with a new Department of Defense requirement that contractors be third-party certified that the company is securing the government data. Please be safe, everyone.